As you start growing and scaling your applications, if you're using React Query, things can start to get out of hand pretty quickly. So as your application grows and it goes from maybe a little side project or something that you're playing with to something that is a little bit larger, and you start getting more API endpoints, more different types of data that you're consuming on the front end. I'm going to say maybe 25, 50, even 100 different types of data or API endpoints that you're calling at that point. You want to make sure that the architecture and the structure for which you are using React Query scales with it as well too. So what I want to do is walk you through the design decisions that I've made as I scale up projects using React Query, and how it can really simplify your code and ensuring that you've got very clean and modular hooks and ways to update your data. So one of the key features with React Query, obviously, is that when you query the data, it stays cached locally, but then when you perform some kind of a mutation, if you're not doing optimistic UI, you can then call to invalidate a specific cache, and React Query will then handle refetching that data back on the server. So what I want to do is show you how I do that in a consistent manner with larger scale applications. So what we've got right here, I've just got a very, very basic application that all we've got is two different types of data contacts right here and different programming languages. And then we've got two mutations here for adding contacts and adding languages. So if I just want to go over here and add a new name, we'll just say John, and the programming language is TypeScript. I'll go ahead and click add. Okay, so it adds it to the UI right here, and if I just do a refresh, this is just storing the data in a database using Prisma. We're not going to be going over that today, but basically it just persists that data, and we've got it all updated right here. Then in terms of the languages over here, so you saw over here that these languages right here correlate with the languages that I've got on the right-hand side. So if we want to add another language right here, we'll just do Kotlin, okay? And click add, all right, it gets added, and then it's automatically updated here as well too. I didn't have to do any page refreshes or anything along those lines. Um, Lastly, in terms of all languages, you can then filter them with, say, we'll do Java, or you can do Python. Now, obviously, you can go ahead and do this filtering on the front end, but for demo purposes, I'm actually making API requests in order to do this. So what I want to do is hop on over to the code right now, show you how it stands, how you might get something stood up initially, and then what I typically do to make sure that the provide you with the patterns to scale your React Query integrations as your application gets a little bit larger. So let's hop on over to VS Code, and I'm going to just do a quick walkthrough here of what the code currently looks like, and then we'll hop into some of the details. So this is I'm using Tanstack Start right now. I've got a bunch of demo applications in here. So the only thing you really need to be, we're really going to focus on right here is this scalable React Query route. And we'll just start going through the code here. So this is specific to Tanstack Start. You don't necessarily need to worry about this for right now, but this is what creates the actual route itself. To start, I'm going to go down to the actual route component itself. So the first thing we've got is this use state, which is either a string or a null, and this sets the language ID. So when we go on over here and you change this, it sets the actively selected option, and ensures that we fetch the data correlated with it. After that, we are loading contacts. Okay, so this is just regular React query right here. We've got the use query right here. We've got the contacts as the query key for this is the prefix essentially, and then we have the language ID. So that just gets fed in right there. And then we are setting up the query function here. So we're calling get contacts, which this is just a server function, essentially just an API call. And then we're checking if there is a language ID and the language ID is not equal to all, then we're going to pass in the actual language ID that we want to filter by. Otherwise, it's just going to be undefined. So, we want it to be all contacts here. To go along with that, we also have another use query for the languages. This one's a little bit more simple. So we've got the query key is just languages, and then the query functions get languages, which is just once again, this is the API endpoint that we're calling right here. So it's just an asynchronous function. We then have a use mutation, which we are going to call back, get the mutate async function back from it, and we're just going to rename it to create contact. Here's the API endpoint for it. We're just calling it add contact. This is the nice thing with Tanstack Start. Just a little side note, if you haven't used it yet, is these are basically RPC calls. Said another way, these are just asynchronous functions. So you don't have to do fetch or anything along those lines. You just call these functions in async manner. Tanstack Start handles everything else for you. So this is where things start to get a little bit interesting, is that whenever this mutation is completed, we've got an onSuccess callback where we are grabbing the query client, invalidating the queries, and then you pass in the query key. and that is this query key up here. So those two match. So every time that we create a new contact, we're going to fetch the updated data from the server and make sure we get the updated contacts here. Hopefully this should be pretty straightforward. It's just kind of a walkthrough as how this is actually working. But there's a couple things I want to clean up here. So the first one is that obviously we've got all of this in one file. I want to break this on out and I'll show you how I go about doing that. The other one too is that the invalidate queries. So as your application grows, a lot of times probably what you'll see is when you call let's say you call create contact, you might actually want to be invalidating a handful of different collections or queries in general. So what happens a lot of times is if you are setting up your create contact like this in multiple locations all throughout your app, let's say you want to call create contact in like 3 different locations in your app, then you have to remember that you need to invalidate the queries, every single query that you've got. So let's say you've got like 3 of these, you have to remember in each location that you need to invalidate it several times. So that could be something, yeah, it could be something that could be easily forgot. Another thing as well too is that I feel like this is kind of a lot of code, and you have to read through every part of it pretty much to understand what's going on. So I think just in terms of when you're building applications or just writing code in general, a majority of the time you're actually reading a lot more code than you are writing. So I always like to optimize my code for readability, not writability. So the way that I typically like to structure this in larger scale applications is the first thing I'll do is I like to co-locate my server code along with the hooks that I'm actually creating, and to create hooks that are very specific to the data that I'm fetching and mutating. So what I'm going to do is let's go ahead and start with contacts over here. All right. So the first thing I'm going to do is I've got this. Let's do get contacts first. So we've got get contacts, and this is the server side code. So we haven't walked through this yet. So let me do that real quick. Let me first move this on over. And then we'll go through this. Z, and we'll do an export. Okay, so what I've got right here is this create server function. So in Tanstack Start, these are RPCs. These are essentially your API endpoints. And the way that this works is that it has a validator. So these are additional parameters that you can pass on in. So whenever you're calling this function, you can pass in a schema validator. So right now I'm using Zod, and we've got a object that is optional, so you don't necessarily have to. But if you pass in a language ID, then we'll filter upon based upon that. And then you've got the handler. This is what actually executes on the server to fetch the data that you want. So we're just using Prisma right here. So we're just doing from the programmer table, we're doing a find many. And then if the user actually passed in the language ID, then we're going to add this additional where clause. So where language ID is equal to the one that they passed in. Otherwise, we're just going to leave that. We're not going to do anything. And then we want to include for the contacts, we want to include the languages. So this is just doing a join for you right there. As I mentioned previously, I do like to co-locate the server-side data along with the actual hooks on the client side that fetches the data. So what I'm going to do is I've got some code copied on my other screen over here. I'm going to bring this on over. Okay, so now what this does is we have a single hook that now encapsulates everything. So instead of calling use query, we're going to do use contacts, and then this sets up use query. So this is the use query from React Query right here. We're going to return that as the final result. Okay, but we're doing a little extra processing here. So the first thing is we're going to pass in some query args, which is the get contacts validator. What is get contacts validator? So we've got the schema, which is what the backend or the server function is expecting as a parameter. And then using Zod, we can then infer the type of it, so we can get the actual TypeScript type for it. And we're calling that get contact validator, just with a capital G right there. Okay, and we're going to say that query args is an optional parameter that you can pass in to this object right here. And we'll get to that one in a little bit, how that's actually implemented. And then the next potential one that you have is the options. So this, don't let this TypeScript scare you at all. I will walk through this very shortly. But essentially the options is the remaining options that you've got for use query. So the way that this works is we've got this use query options. This is a generic coming from React Query up here. Essentially, all that's saying is I want this type, the type of the options that's get passed into use query. So if I get rid of this right here, what I'm saying is all of these properties right here. Okay, so that's that. But what we also need to do is to pass in the type, the return type of this function, of this get contacts right here. The way that I go about getting that is we need to do the type of contacts. So type of get contacts right there. All right. And then we want the return type of it, which returns a promise. And we want to get the awaited, so the unwrapped promise version of it. And all of that then gets passed into this use query options, okay, which is this options right here. And we are going to omit query key and query function. So the user cannot pass in query key or query function. The reason being is because this hook is the one that is specifying those values there. We don't want the person who's calling use contacts to overwrite anything that we're doing with this. All right. So we've got the contacts. This is our what I'm calling the query key prefix. All right. And then we've got these query args, as I mentioned before, is that these are optional. So like when we were calling, when we've got this all languages right here, there's essentially no query args that are being added. We just want everything. But if you have additional modifiers, say the language ID, then that would get passed in right here. So these query args right here are, we're getting this from the args object. This is the args object right here. And once again, this is optional in itself as well too. So if they don't pass one in, we're just going to default to an empty object. If they do, then we'll just use the actual args and we'll get the query args. So if I hover over here, you can see it's either undefined or we'll have language ID. And then one of the things with the query keys with React Query is that you cannot pass in undefined as a value right here. So we need to just do a check on that. If it is undefined, then we'll just pass in null. So it would be contacts null or contacts, and then the actual query args here, which would be language ID followed by a string. And then all we're doing here is we are then calling get contacts. So this is what we were doing previously before, is we're doing get contacts right here. Okay, and then we're passing in the data, and then we've got the query args, which gets passed in there. So just so you know, whenever you're in Tanstack Start, at the very least, when you set a validator right here, it always expects an object to start with a data key. So as I type, you can see data, and then just so you can see the type hinting right here, language ID. So which is the same as putting in this. Okay, so now that we got that, we can go ahead and replace. We should technically just be able to replace this. We're going to get rid of all of that code right there, and we're just going to do use contacts. Okay, and if I go back and refresh this should still technically work. So I refreshed, you see that all that works, but now we're missing the function, we're missing the data type for, or I'm sorry, we're missing the language ID for updating the call because we're not passing anything in here. Okay, so now what we want to do is hook back up that language ID parameter as well too. So I'm going to go ahead and supply that optional argument that we previously spoke about before, and we'll have cursor do most of that right here. So we will do this and that. Okay, so essentially we're the same logic that we had before. If there's a language ID and it doesn't equal to all, then we're going to pass out language ID, otherwise it'll be undefined. So that's cool. Let's go ahead and reload this. And now you can see that we've got this working all over again. So we can query by language ID. Awesome. So that's good. But one of the nice things too is the reason why we've got this optional options, all right, is that we can do options right here. And then these are all of the options that we previously, that React Query gives you. So what we're essentially doing is we've got this use query. You don't want to take away all the functionality of use query because there's still instances where there's one-off or for specific implementation of calling use contacts, you still want to access the ability to configure that specific instance. So if that's the case, if you want to say this is enabled or not, then we could just say, whether or not language ID is defined. Okay, so if it's not defined, then we're not going to do anything. But then this specific use case, then we can go ahead and make the call. That's one of the reasons why I like to wrap it and still give you the options, is that you can still configure your use query for any specific instance, but it's not necessarily required. So the cool thing is now that you can see that this code's significantly easier to read, we can just call use contacts, and then you still have the same API with use query. It's just that we've got a little bit more stuff taken care of for you. So we're going to go ahead and do the same thing for the mutation. So if I want to do a add contact, I'm going to go ahead and move that over here as well too. Okay, and this is the Zod schema. We're going to add that. We're going to, you actually technically don't even need to export the API code because your front end is calling it right here. So use mutation. Okay, create contact. We're going to bring that on over here. And what we're going to do is we'll write this one by hand then. Okay. So we'll do use add contact. We're going to return this use mutation right here. We're going to call the add contact up here. Okay, and we'll go ahead and save that. Then we're invalidating the queries. So one last thing I like to do as well too is I will always do a export const, and then we will call this contacts query key. Query key prefix. Okay. And I will replace that here. And we'll do that right here as well too. So the reason why I do that is because when you are working, let's say when we're adding a create language and we want to invalidate, maybe we have something that wants to invalidate contacts, instead of having to go in here and manually dig for the actual query key itself, we just know that we are exporting this queries key prefix right here. So I would rather just pass this in as a const as opposed to try and search for the exact specific string that we've got. So the cool thing here is now we can do a import that, add contact. You can see the code has become much more simple now and a little bit easier to read. So we're going to go ahead and do the same thing for the last one for languages. So I'll move this on over here and we will do a get languages. Okay, I'm just going to import that. We'll now export. Yep. Use languages, use query. Let's see how quick cursor's doing. Pretty good so far. Okay, and what I'm going to do is the same idea that we had in this context right here. Is we're going to pass in these args right here. That's going to go over. So this is the. So we're passing on over the args over there, the get contacts validator, so we don't have that yet. We've got get languages, which there are no query args for this one. We're just going to do all. So we can go ahead and just completely remove the query args for this specific one. And we want to call that get languages, so that gets updated. What else do we got here? So the query key, as I said, there's no additional filters here, so we just do the actual languages right there, and then we've got the query function here. Lastly, we want to make sure that we're passing in the options, and the options come from the args here. So we're deconstructing the options from the args if they're available, and if they are, then we go ahead and pass them on into the options there. So let me move this back on over, and we're going to do create language. And we want to do export const create language. I'm sorry, use create language. Okay, add language, add language. We're going to bring this back on down over here. Okay, and add language. Yeah, I think cursor got a little bit too happy there. Okay, add language. Let me bring this on over. Keep this up with our server code. So we got use languages, get languages, import Zod, add language. Okay. Cool. So that's a mutation function. So we have a use language, and we are going to make sure that that is. I'm going to make sure that that's imported back over here. So languages, use create language. Okay. And we're going to have default. So we've got the two mutation functions. So use create language, use add contact. Okay, and then the very last one is languages. We want to have use languages. So now we just did a lot. Obviously, cursor just sped up the process, but hopefully you were able to follow that so far. So if we go back here, hopefully everything should still work. So we're going to go ahead and reload that, and we're going to add a new language, and we will call this one, what else don't we have here? Fortran. Let's do good old Fortran. So I do an update. All right, this is automatically updated over here. And once again, this is not doing any kind of optimistic UI. Actually, let me just go ahead and show you that right here. So if we just do a network, the way that this is pulling this on over is doing a second network request. So instead of Fortran, let's just do C. Okay, click add, and you can see that we've got it doing a post, all right, with the name of C. And then we are doing a get right here. When I do that, that's not what I want. Preview, here we go, results. So this is now pulling it back from the database itself, and then that is what is being used to update this list over here. So we'll just say test, add contact. Okay, cool. And then that's how this all languages is updated as well too. So we're fetching the data there. Okay, so there's a little bit more work here that we got to do for this use mutation option. So use mutation actually takes a couple more options here. So what we need to do is for use add language, one of the things that we want to add is the, let me see here, add language, is we're going to move this on out to its own object. So we'll just call it add language schema. So we move that there, and we're going to do type. So now we've got the actual type for this. Let's make sure we pass that back on in there. All right, so we've got the type that the add language function is expecting right there. I'm going to go down, and we are going to, the next parameter is going to be an error. Let me just make sure so you can see what's going on here. So when I hover on over this generic, the first one is expecting the data, then the error, then the variable. So we've got the data right here, and then the error, and then we've got the actual arguments that are going into our mutation function here, which is the add language schema. So you can see that this now lines up. So data right here, this should be data, and then just name as a string, and then that gets passed on to add language, and add language is then called up here, passes through the validator, and then this handler is happy with all of the content that's coming on through that way. So what you'll see is when you are doing this with mutations, there might be a little bit more work. So if we've got options right here, and if they're supplying their own options right here, it can actually override our on success that we know every single time we call use create language, we always want to invalidate the language query key prefix. We don't want somebody to overwrite that. So what we would actually do here is we would do a on success and get the rest of the options. Okay, so now this options right here no longer has an on success. It can't override it, but we need to make sure that if somebody else still wants to call on success, that we can still call it. So I'm going to do an on success. If they actually pass that on in, then we're going to go ahead and call it. And I'm going to add, let's see here, args. So we're going to gather all of the arguments right here from on success, and we're going to pass that on in. We'll spread that. So what we're doing is conditionally calling the on success option that they pass in conjunction with, but also after what we are calling ourselves internally. So the way that this would actually work is now whenever they do what do we do? Use create language. If they go ahead and pass in an optional object, and we've got options on success, and we will just do a alert language has been created. So when the two things should happen now is that we should be invalidating this query. So we should be performing a second get after one is already created. And then the other one here is that we're going to be doing an alert. And then the last thing I saw right here is that we want the rest of the options. You don't want options, you want the rest of the options to then be spread across there. So this way, like I said, on success will not overwrite what we have. So now if we go back on over here, and we do an add language, running out of languages here, TypeScript, JavaScript. Okay, we'll do add language. Cool, you can say that was added, and then it should automatically be over here as well too. Okay, So, as you can see, I think that this makes it significantly easier to reason about all of the different ways that you can use React Query within your application. It cleans things up a lot. When you get to your components, you want to make sure that most of the code that you've got in here primarily should a lot of it should just be HTML with maybe a little bit of state. Anything that you consolidate into hooks. I think is a great way to go about it. It just makes it a lot easier to read. This is just pretty straightforward as opposed to having to go through all of the different query and validation logic and callbacks and all that other stuff. The nice thing is you still have those options available to you if you want them, but you don't necessarily need to have all that information or to have all that functionality every single time you set it up. And lastly, the one thing that we talked about here as well too is that you can easily access key invalidation. So the way I want to show you that one last thing I want to show you here is on this success. If we want to, then we can now also update the what was it, contacts. Okay, so I don't have to go searching around for what the actual string value is. I can just pass in a constant right there, and I know that that is directly located with my server-side code, my client-side code, and I've got the cache key. All of it's nice and confined to one location, so I know exactly where to find that information. And there's a much smaller chance that you're going to incorrectly type the wrong key within your invalidated queries right there. So hopefully this is helpful. Hopefully you see the value in being able to scale your React query this code. So appreciate you watching. Thank you.